Welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm Matthew Spaulding, Associate Vice President Dean for Hillsdale College here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Alan P. Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. This place is an extension of the teaching mission of Hillsdale College, which is to provide sound learning for the defense of civil and religious liberty. And the college has been doing that since its founding in Hillsdale, Michigan in 1844. We gather at a time of great turmoil, by which I don't mean we are somewhere between Iowa and New Hampshire. The turmoil we face has to do with what amounts, in my opinion, to a new form of government that is all around us. The keys to our great success as a country are the principles at its root, found in the Declaration of Independence, equal rights and consent, and the framework for government provided by the United States Constitution. In that Constitution, delegated powers derived not from government, but from the consent of the governed, are separated and divided so as to provide for checks and balances against the accumulation of power, which the founders, Federalist Papers, thought was the very definition of tyranny. Each branch is vested with distinct powers and responsibilities having to do with legislating, executing, and adjudicating the law. Yet today, here we are, government is bigger than ever, spends more than ever, and acts increasingly without limits. We are ensnared by a vast web of its rules and regulations, mostly the work of innumerable agencies and departments under the President. Many actual decisions of lawmaking, most in many ways, previously the responsibility of our elected legislators, are being made by unelected bureaucrats, whose rules have the full force and authority of laws promulgated by Congress. There, of course, is a longer story here having to do with the politics of the 20th century, the rise of progressivism, liberalism, in the modern administrative state. Progressive thinkers, in both political parties, I might add, wanted to shift authority away from policy and political decision makers in favor of expert rule. But the main problem is that for too long, too many Congresses have created these bureaucracies to carry out their wishes, while at the same time delegating to them legislative powers in the form of broad regulatory authority. That the President of the United States is exerting newfound quote-unquote powers, given the tempting amount of authority delegated to and claimed by those ostensibly under his control, should come as no surprise. We have just come to the point where modern presidents have figured out how to use those powers. But it's a dangerous symptom of the bureaucratic rule that is currently overwhelming us, replacing our constitutional form of government. Much government occurs outside consent, is increasingly irresponsible, and has created an imbalance in our constitutional structure. The only way to reverse this trend of a diminishing legislature is for Congress to rebuild itself, strengthening its constitutional muscles in our separation of powers system. That's the solution envisioned by our founders, consistent with popular consent. A stronger legislative branch would go a long way towards making the role of government a political question, rightly, as it should be, subject to election, rather than executive fiat or judicial decree, regardless of who the next president is and what political party they belong to. The solution is for Congress as a co-equal branch of government to regain its legislative authority, bringing consent and responsibility back to government through better lawmaking up front and oversight after the fact. And the one place where that power is not entirely lost by any means, and where is there a great opportunity for gaining leverage over an unchecked executive, is Congress's power of the purse. Regular legislative order, authorizing, appropriating, overseeing the operations of government, will do more than anything else to restore the Article I powers of Congress. Done well, it will also prevent Congress from continually getting cornered in large, messy, and unacceptable omnibus budgets. This project, the Article I project, is a bicameral effort of House and Senate conservatives to develop an agenda to strengthen and reclaim Congress's constitutional powers. It will focus on reclaiming the powers of the purse, restoring congressional authority over regulators and regulations, and reining in executive discretion. The goal of the project is to reconstitutionalize the federal government by rebuilding Congress as the legislative branch, the first among equals, in order to secure our liberty, provide opportunity, and promote American self-government. Hillsdale College is pleased to contribute to this project and to host its launch here at our facility, and we commend its work. We will have some brief remarks this morning by a few speakers, to be followed by two panels, hosted by Jim Capretta of AEI and Yuval Levin, National Affairs. But right now, I'm very happy to turn the podium over to a scholar of the Constitution, a practitioner of the law, and a friend, Senator Mike Lee of Utah.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Matt. Thanks to all of you for being here for this event that I've been very excited about for some time. It's altogether fitting that we should have this event here, and I'm honored and humbled that we're holding it just underneath this beautiful painting, this wonderful depiction of the miracle at Philadelphia. The only downside is that this painting is a little bit intimidating for me, because when I'm standing in front of it, I feel like they're looking down at me as if to say, "You're doing it wrong." As if to say, we specifically said in Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. You're doing it wrong because other people are making the laws. But that's, after all, why we're here today. Today's event is the official launch of the Article 1 project. It's also a fitting reflection of what our project is all about. In the speeches and the panels that will follow, you'll hear from 9 conservative policymakers about how they intend to help fix what's wrong with Washington and help us change the way we have departed from the Constitution to restore the constitutional structures and protections. And you're going to see an approach to policymaking in stark contrast to the way that bills are so often written today, that is an open, collaborative process and an ideas-driven process. This is the Article 1 project in a nutshell. It's a new network of House and Senate conservatives working together on a new agenda of government reform, and one that focuses on congressional rehabilitation. The premise of the Article 1 project is very simple. The federal government's broken, and congressional weakness is to blame. Congressional acquiescence is at the very heart of the problems that we face in Washington. The authors of the Constitution made Congress the most powerful of the federal government's 3 co-equal branches. Congress was designed both as the most powerful and as the most accountable to the people, and it was no coincidence that it occurred in this fashion. Consent of the governed in any republic depends on transparent policymaking within representative institutions. Congress's embrace of this mandate is part of what has made America both successful and also exceptional. But if there's one thing politicians of every political party and of every ideology tend to agree on, it's that hard work and accountability are inconvenient. They're rarely easy. In fact, they never are. They weren't designed to be. They perform a different but even more important function. And so over the course of the 20th century and accelerating into the 21st century, Congress has handed many of its constitutional responsibilities over to the executive branch. Increasingly harmful federal laws are increasingly written by people who never stand for election, via processes contrary to those provided for in the Constitution, and indeed with the explicit purpose of excluding the American people from their government and shielding policymakers from popular accountability. This part of it is not a bug. It is, in fact, a feature, and it's a feature that has to be reversed. Executive overreach is an enormous problem, but it's a problem largely, in fact, almost entirely, of Congress's own making. Under Houses, Senates, Presidents, and Supreme Courts of every conceivable partisan combination, Congress has recast itself as the backseat driver in American politics. Today, the vast majority of federal laws, upwards of 95%, are passed not by the House and Senate and signed by the President, but instead they're imposed unilaterally by unelected executive branch bureaucrats. At the same time, Congress's budget process has almost entirely broken down. Most federal spending has been put on autopilot, effectively, authorized without a vote. Meanwhile, fiscal oversight, deliberation, and reform are a bipartisan charade of sorts. This upending of our constitutional order has led not only to bad policy, but also to deep and legitimate public distrust in our governing institutions. This dysfunction is a large and a growing problem for the American Republic. And for conservatives, it represents something like a crisis for at least two reasons. First, conservatives believe in constitutionalism and the rule of law as such as bulwarks for protecting freedom and justice in our society. And second, this massive wholesale transfer of lawmaking power from Congress to the executive branch unmistakably tilts the policymaking field, rigging the lawmaking process to benefit the wealthy and the well-connected at the expense of everyone else, and perhaps most noticeably at the expense of America's poor middle class. When elected representatives in Congress tie their own hands and empower unelected bureaucrats to make our laws, and in fact, to make the overwhelming majority of our laws, measured by volume, measured by most measures that are available here, it unavoidably thwarts the kinds of policies that conservatives tend to advocate. That is, policies that limit the size and scope of government, and by so doing, protect the equal rights and opportunities available to all Americans. So it's no wonder Congress's job approval ratings are at historic lows. You know, most polls put our approval ratings at somewhere around 10%, which makes us slightly less popular than Fidel and Raul Castro in America. And it makes us only slightly more popular than the influenza virus, which is rapidly gaining on us. In many ways, we're not even doing our job, and the nation is paying the price. But there is some good news. What a weak Congress has broken, a strong Congress can fix. And a strong Congress will fix. The constitutional powers necessary to put a representative accountable, federal government back to work for the American people, are still right there in the Constitution. They're still right there in Article 1 of our governing document, ready to be reasserted. All that remains is for us to assert them properly. That is exactly why we're launching the Article 1 project here today. The purpose of the project is to develop, advance, and ultimately enact an agenda of meaningful structural reforms to strengthen Congress by reclaiming its constitutional legislative powers that today are being improperly delegated to and ultimately exercised by the executive branch. Specifically, A1P will focus on restoring congressional power in four key areas that are at the core of Washington, D.C.'s broken status quo. First, reclaiming Congress's power of the purse. Second, reforming legislative cliffs. Third, reasserting congressional authority over regulations and over regulated cores. And finally, curbing executive discretion. My colleagues will talk in more detail about these four pillars of the Article 1 project that we're forming today, and they'll explain what A1P seeks is not so much to change Congress as to revive it. You see, Congress as it exists, Congress as it was created, Congress as it was provided for in Article 1 of the Constitution, has the power to do all of these things. We're just reviving it. We're just restoring that which has been diminished over time, that which has been clouded by other things. To make it once again live up to its founding purpose. To be the driving force in federal policymaking, not for the sake of the ambitions of any individual politician, or even the collective ambitions of all federal politicians, but rather to protect and empower the American people they represent. Our goal here is simply to make Congress once again responsible, both in the sense of performing our constitutional duties, and also performing those duties transparently so that our fellow Americans can hold us accountable for the choices we make on their behalf. All that stands between today's broken status quo and a government of, by, and for the people is the will of Congress to finally step up and do its job. For decades, Congress has done nearly everything in its power to do exactly the opposite. It's done everything it possibly can, everything it can think of to avoid doing its job, to surrender its constitutional powers to the executive branch, to have somebody else make the law. And the country and the American people have suffered tremendously as a result. But with these 9 lawmakers, their collective and innovative ideas for reform and their endless supply of political courage and energy, we have the power to change that. It is truly an honor to be part of this effort, and I look forward to standing side by side with this group of lawmakers in many future battles on Capitol Hill. Few people in Congress have been fighting this fight as long or as successfully as Chairman Jeb Hensarling. It's been a privilege working with him on A1P, and it's my privilege to hand the podium over to him. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you for the honor of working with you yet again. Some of you know that Mike and I just finished a huge battle against corporate welfare. It could have gone a little better. But it's time for another battle, and perhaps even a more important one, in the short time that Senator Mike Lee has been in Washington. What a great fighter, what a great champion, what a crusader for liberty and the Constitution he has proven to be. And I'm glad to renew our partnership yet again on this incredible, important project. I'm also honored to be on this turf, Hillsdale, also indispensable to the cause of liberty, all the great things that they have done. Thank you for hosting, Matt, this event. And yes, it is intimidating to speak in the shadow of this painting. It is a reminder, though, that just this last summer, my wife and I took our 12-year-old son and 13-year-old daughter to Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It is important for my wife and I that our children learn about the cause of liberty, learn about American exceptionalism. And as often as I've been to Independence Hall, it is still stirring to walk in the footsteps of the Patriots. But when you're there, you're reminded of the stories of what America was at that point in our history. There was crushing debt. There was rampant inflation in our young nation. There were bitter trade disputes. Some in Massachusetts even threatened secession. In retrospect, maybe not such a bad idea, but I sense that moment has passed. Patrick Henry, you may recall, boycotted the proceedings. Madison and General Henry Knox had to travel to Mount Vernon to talk Washington into even attending the event. Edmund Randolph worried as the delegates gathered, quote, "Are we not on the eve of war, which is only prevented by the hopes from this Constitution?" Indeed, much despair and anguish ruled the day, and more than once the entire enterprise depicted in this wonderful painting seemed destined for failure. But it didn't fail. It didn't fail because the spirit of '76 was still alive and well and resounded echoingly in those hallowed halls. So the seeds of American exceptionalism that were surely planted in 1776 took firm root in 1787. It is then that we, the people, truly secured our liberty, and the course of human events would never be the same. In his penultimate statement of the Union message, President Reagan reminded us of these 3 simple words: we, the people, make all the difference between our Constitution and the constitutions of other nations. In those other constitutions, he said, quote, "The government tells the people what they are allowed to do. In our Constitution, we, the people, tell the government what it can do, and that it can only do those things that are listed in that document and no others." So the sheer genius of our Constitution, its framework of checks and balances, limited enumerated powers, co-equal branches of government, secured our fundamental rights and gave rise to the freest, most prosperous civilization the world has ever known. But to put it mildly, over the years, many of these principles have been neglected and others outright abandoned. Instead of a limited government operating from a clearly defined enumeration of powers, we have a Leviathan, that has metastasized into the nation's largest creditor, debtor, employer, property owner, tenant, insurer, healthcare provider, pension underwriter, and I would go on, but I have run out of breath. Instead of checks and balances, we have the president's pen and phone. Instead of three co-equal branches of government, we have seen the ominous rise of the unaccountable fourth branch of government, namely agency government. It is a reminder that although we have ominous foreign threats to our safety and security that lead the nightly news, threats that emanate from faraway capitals like Moscow, Damascus, and Tehran, we cannot and must not lose sight of the domestic threats to our freedom and liberties that emanate from another capital city far closer to home, namely Washington, D.C. Some of these domestic threats may appear less evident in the short term, but over time they are as corrosive to our Constitution and to our national well-being as individuals and as a nation. None of us can ever afford to lose sight of Madison's famous warning that, quote, there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment by those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations. That's why we're gathered here today to launch the Article 1 project, a new network of conservatives working together to reclaim Congress's rightful constitutional role. I'm privileged to co-chair this effort. I'm honored to serve with my colleagues in this effort. As members of Congress, we have no more important jobs to take more seriously than upholding the Constitution. Yet I do not recall ever in my lifetime when I have seen the Constitution under as much assault as it is today. Just in the last few years, we've seen an American president unilaterally create new law, annul existing law, and even declare the Senate in recess when it was not so, just so he could install political functionaries into top government positions. Clearly, that whole advice and consent foolishness can be such a bother to a president. This from a man who frequently reminds us that he used to be a constitutional law professor. I have no doubt that his former students have a valid cause of action for teaching malpractice, and I trust the statute of limitations has not run. The adherents of this governing philosophy, so at odds with America's founding principles, call themselves progressive. As my good friend, Speaker Paul Ryan, has said, the ironic thing about progressivism is that it's so terribly old-fashioned. For progressives believe only a certain class of people, a class to which they, of course, belong, has the duty and the responsibility to hold political power. And we, the rest of us, we the people, must yield to their expert management for our own good, because as one architect of Obamacare said, the rest of us are just too stupid to know better. How could we possibly know what health insurance plan is best for us, what kind of mortgage we need, or even how much water we should use to flush our toilets? To progressives, the Constitution is a huge inconvenience. Herbert Crowley, a leading voice of the early progressive movement and co-founder of the New Republic magazine, said as much when he stated that the progressive vision of government, quote, legislates but without being a legislature. It administers but without being an executive. It adjudicates but without any power of attaching final construction to the law. It is simply a convenient means of consolidating the divided activities of the government for certain practical social purposes. Madison, in Federalist Number 47, had a different take on the notion when he wrote, quote, the combination of all power, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. The seed of this form of tyranny was planted during the Wilson administration, bloomed during FDR's New Deal, became overgrown in LBJ's Great Society, has now reached crisis proportions under President Obama. This century-long progressive expansion of unconstitutional government has unleashed the modern regulatory state as we know it today. Extremely powerful, exceedingly intrusive, imperiously opaque, baffingly bureaucratic, and alarmingly unaccountable. Now, Congress has been no innocent bystander during all of this. Part of the reason that we have this out-of-control regulatory state is because for far too long, Congress has outsourced its constitutional responsibilities. As we all know, Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution states, quote, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. Thus, when Congress delegates its fundamental legislative authority to an unaccountable, unelected bureaucracy, it has arguably acted in an unconstitutional manner. This self-enfeeblement must end. Because when Congress allows its authority to be usurped, the people's right to both self-government and due process is undermined. Instead of being governed by the rule of law, citizens become more and more governed by the rule of rulers and the discretion of regulators. The citizens' right to carefully deliberate proposed legislation through their representatives in Congress becomes reduced to nothing more but a notice and comment period when they are permitted to merely lodge complaints and suggestions, all of which the unelected bureaucrats are free to ignore, all of which the unelected bureaucrats may use to retaliate. The result? It is OSHA now, not Congress, that governs over workplace safety. It is the EPA now, not Congress, that governs our air quality. It is HHS now, not Congress, that governs over our health care. And most alarmingly to our economic opportunity and economic liberty, it is the bureaucratic progeny of Dodd-Frank that now rules over our financial markets. So where do we go from here? First, Congress. Congress must reaffirm the primacy of congressional authority. And of all the tools that we can use to address this, none is greater than the power of the purse. This Article 1 responsibility is the most potent and effective instrument we have to hold the executive accountable. To paraphrase a rather colorful Texan, President Lyndon Baines Johnson, if you grab a bureaucracy by its budget, its hearts and minds will soon follow. For years, Congress has slowly surrendered its constitutional power over federal spending, and our first priority must be to reclaim it. To do so, Congress needs to seriously reform the budget process and come up with an entirely new one. Earlier in my career, National Review once called me representative budget reform, so I am eager to start this work in earnest yet again. In addition to budget reform, Congress must also end the practice of delegating this lawmaking authority to the unaccountable, unelected agency government. No more passing vague laws to direct agencies to fill in the blanks. So, for example, the REINS Act, which has already passed the House, would introduce both constitutional accountability into the system by requiring that Congress approve any major new legislations. The act is simple, the act is profound, and its passage must be part of this incredibly important effort. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us each today take our stand for freedom as in olden time when the brave patriots stood for freedom at Independence Hall. That remarkable group who dared to believe they could start the world all over again. So let us each today, as part of this Article 1 process, let us dare to believe that we can again secure the blessings of liberty for coming generations in America. Let us rededicate ourselves to Article 1 of the Constitution. Thank you. Well, since today is Old Partners Day, it is my pleasure to introduce another old partner, Senator Jeff Flake. When Jeff served in the House, we took on the earmark wars, and as I recall, we lost every single battle, but we won the war. And we have lost a number of battles in fighting for the Constitution, but we will win this war. And I know of no happier warrior for the cause of freedom and liberty than Senator Jeff Flake, my friend from Arizona. Senator Flake.
Well, thank you, Jeb. I have to correct that. Of all the hundreds and hundreds of times we went to the floor to challenge earmarks, we did win one. There was one vote that came, but the war followed, and we did get rid of legislative earmarks. Now the problem is what goes on in the executive branch and with the agencies. And I will not try to go over what has been gone over so well by Mike Lee and Jeb Hensarling, two of my legislative heroes here. But let me just talk about regulations for a minute. Jeb talked about the power of the purse and how to get our Article 1 authority back. If anybody wants to know how bad it's gotten in terms of what the executive branch is able to do, is look at the publication, Federal Register. It's published Monday through Friday. It runs anywhere from 100 to over 1,000 pages every day. It's comprised almost entirely of newly noticed regulations. It is an alarming snapshot of Washington's bureaucracy growing, and it's a sad chronicle of Congress's ever diminishing role in the governing process. On average, more than 4,000 new regulations come into effect each year. Another 2,700 are proposed. These are crafted by unelected bureaucrats and administration-run agencies. And we have to change this equation. As Jeb mentioned, the power of the purse is really the way to do that. There is no way that we can win the political battle when we only have one bill at the end of the year and have an up or down vote. You simply lose any leverage you have. And we've got to get back to when we pass appropriations measures one by one, and therefore can have some reign over the the regulatory process. Let me just give you two brief examples of how bad it's gotten. I'm from Arizona. We sometimes have dust storms that roll through. They completely come in and you can't see your hand in front of your face for a while. These dust storms have been coming through Arizona for decades and centuries, probably millennia. My family has been in Arizona for 5 generations. These dust storms have always been there. But now they are regulated as if they were somehow a man-made phenomenon. And every time a dust storm rolls through Maricopa County, the cities and governing entities, the county, spends hundreds of thousands of dollars to convince the EPA that was a so-called exceptional event and not as a result of pollution that occurs from man-made sources. The EPA knows this, but still we have to go through the exercise every time one of these dust storms occurs, and they occur frequently every couple of weeks in the summertime. Another example, in northern Arizona, there's a power plant, a coal-fired power plant, that powers a good chunk of, most of that power is used to pump the water from the Colorado River that feeds a lot of central Arizona. Very important source of power for us. It complies and has been made to comply with every EPA mandate out there in terms of clean air at great expense to the ratepayers and the people of Arizona. But the EPA came and said that's not good enough. We want to look at visibility, even though there was no congressional prerogative or no law that said that. They said we want to make sure that it's not negatively impacting visibility in the national parks, like the Grand Canyon. Now, so they conducted some studies and found that even after spending billions of dollars, there would not be a perceptible change in any visibility standards. The wind typically blows the other way. But that didn't stop them. And so they're looking for ways to shut this power plant down, and that's what they've chosen to do. So these agencies are certainly out of control. Congress needs to reinvigorate, and I can see no better way than for us to have a project like this. And I commend Mike Lee and others for envisioning this, and for Hillsdale for hosting today. And it's a pleasure to be with so many people here that I know and admire and respect on this issue. So thanks for having me here.
We have time for questions from these three speakers before we go to our panels. If we have some, please raise a hand. Gentleman right here. And we have a microphone coming so we can pick up the audio. Thank you very much.
Article 1, Section 1 says all powers shall be vested, not few powers, not some powers, not many powers, and doesn't say could be vested, may be vested. Is that how you saw the Founding Fathers writing it, and is that an argument you all can use to restore Article 1, Section 1?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if there is one encapsulation of the Article 1 project, it's that. I wrote a book about this a few months ago. It's called Our Lost Constitution. I have a very significant section of the book devoted specifically to that point. it is no accident that the first operative provision of the Constitution, the first clause of the first section of the first article, says that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress. And we have reconstrued that so that we say, in effect, some of it may be vested in a Constitution. That's really the way it operates today. The important thing to remember is that this is of our own making. Sometimes when you hear members of Congress talking about overregulation and excessive executive discretion, they speak about it as if we were somehow the victims in this. We're the perpetrators. We designed it that way. Members of Congress are less accountable when it works that way, and that's what we have to turn around.
Over here.
Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, has indicated that in the spring we expect to see a bold new initiative related to this reestablishing Congress's power of the purse. Hopefully that would be addressed in the panel discussion as what we might expect in the spring about the budget and the power of the purse that Congress needs to reassert itself with.
On that one, or?
Well, as the House guy, although not the Speaker guy, I know this is very important to our new Speaker. I hope in many respects that the Article 1 project and what the Speaker has in mind will dovetail, but we recently came from our Republican retreat, and again, I know this is a huge priority with the Speaker. It's a huge priority with our entire House Republican Conference, is represented by a number of our members here today. So all I can say is stay tuned, look forward.
Or in the back. Thank you. Oh, let's get back here. He's waiting back there.
Thank you so much. All of us are very concerned, and you mentioned the power of the purse. But of course, Congress isn't only spending money, it keeps creating new bureaucracies. There's one I've been watching, because I very much care about what's happening on college campuses right now, with the Department of Education destroying due process, imposing ideologies on campus. Senator Gillibrand is pushing one called the Campus Accountability and Safety Act, which does nothing to stop sexual assaults. All it does is create more bureaucracy, more power, more imposition of ideology, more control over the campuses. And what I'm hearing is that Senator Alexander is saying he's not getting enough opposition from Republicans. He may just put it in the Higher Education Reauthorization Act. Somebody needs to stop the creation of new bureaucracies. That goes beyond reducing the funding of existing bureaucracies. So can anybody address how you're going to stop that particular new bureaucracy from being created?
I've not been following that one specifically, but maybe Mike has.
I learned about this a few weeks ago. This is news to me that he's thinking about putting it in the Higher Education Reauthorization Act. I'm glad to know that. I have some major concerns with it and how it would affect due process, the due process rights of the accused. So, yeah, that's a big problem. And I think you also raise a very good underlying point, which is that in addition to reforming the process moving forward to make sure that we go through Congress to make laws, we first ought to stop the bloodletting. We first ought to stop the wound, close the wound so we don't expand the regulatory process and create more outsourcing of legislative power.
And your point that when new entities are created, then we're going the wrong direction. That is certainly the case. When these entities are created, then they feed on themselves, and they require more regulations to exist, and it just rolls. And how many times do we ever go in and extinguish one of these agencies or sub-agencies or offices? So it's a growing problem.
Matt, if I could,
Yes.
I have votes starting in committee in 15 minutes. I'm going to have to excuse myself. And as chairman of the committee, I was the guy who called the vote, so it'd be really embarrassing to be late. So I'm going to have to excuse myself. Thank you very much for being here.
Jim, right here.
Hi, this is on. Kevin Kosar of the R Street Institute. I've written a bit on restoring Congress as the first branch. And one of the problems, it seems to me, is that when you look at the size of the two branches over the last 100 years, the size of Congress in terms of the number of people working for it, the appropriations for it, the support staff, et cetera, has grown a bit, but relative to the executive branch, it's nothing. And so there's a basic structural imbalance there. Oversight's hard when you don't have enough eyes. Do you see beefing up Congress as an institution, more people, more research, et cetera, as part of the project?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. The short answer to that question is I don't think that hiring more people in Congress, hiring more staff in Congress is necessarily the answer there. I think there's a lot more we could do with the personnel that we have if we just do our jobs, if we just do what we're supposed to do. But your question brings to mind a more basic point, which I'm glad you've raised, which is that the people depicted in the painting behind us did not envision what we have today. They did envision the risk that the chief executive could become too powerful. And even though they saw George Washington as the heir apparent to Article 2, they saw George Washington, I don't think they ever envisioned anyone other than George Washington being our first president. There was no more respected man in the world, certainly no more respected man in the Western Hemisphere than George Washington. They trusted him implicitly. He was, after all, rather unprecedented in having wielded tremendous authority in the Revolutionary War. He won the revolution, and then he voluntarily relinquished power at the end of the war. Notwithstanding the respect they had in him and the trust they had in him, they still made the presidency relatively weak. They hindered his power. They made it really hard for him to become anything resembling a king. And yet we've somehow managed to undo that. They put all the power in Congress. The only reason the executive branch is so much more bloated than we are, so much more powerful than we are, is because we have made it that way, and that's why we have to turn it around. We can do that without an army of staff that rivals the executive branch of government in size.
I would agree with that. We obviously have to have the resources to conduct oversight, and we try to utilize them to the fullest. Some of our staff are here, and they'll attest to that. But what we need is a process when we find, all right, here's what this agency is doing that they shouldn't be doing, or here's this project that shouldn't have been approved, it was never authorized. We have to have a process that allows us to go politically and say we're going to cut funding for that or direct it elsewhere. And when you just have one bill at the end of the year, a big omnibus, you forfeit that right, if for no other reason politically. It just can't be done. And so that's why the reforms to our budget process and actually following even the budget process we have, if we were to do that, would give us a lot more power.
We're going to take one more question with these senators, and we'll continue with our other panels. Way in the back.
Last year, a different group called the Article 5 Project gained traction. Texas Governor Greg Abbott is one of the forces behind that. And it has the same goal, which is to limit the power of the executive, but to do so with a constitutional amendment ratified by the state legislatures. So in what way is the Article 1 project meant to be a response to the Article 5 project?
Speaking for myself, I can say not at all. It's not a response to anything other than the Constitution itself and the fact that we've deviated from it substantially over the last century, mostly over the last 80 years. I think that if we followed the Constitution as it's set up, it would help us restore what needs to be restored. And if I can speak to this, the point that we were bringing up at the end of the last question about the budgeting process, I agree with everything Senator Flake said, and I would add to it that regardless of how many appropriations bills we have, regardless of whether we follow the Budget Act as outlined in 1974 and whether we have a dozen bills, the 12 appropriations bill formula was not carved into stone without hands and handed down on tablets. There's nothing magical about the number 12. To me, it'd be great to follow that formula, but to me, the far more important part of the budgeting and appropriations process is that we have debate, deliberation, and most importantly, opportunity for amendment. In other words, I'd rather have 1 or 2 or 3 bills that spend money with an open, unlimited amendment process. Shoot, I'd rather have one single appropriations bill as long as members had an equal, open opportunity to amend that, to debate it in public and to discuss it, than I would have 12 bills where it's brought to the floor and we're told you've got a binary choice on this. You either pass it and you fund it or you vote no, and that's it.
If I give any add to that, or?
No, just that the beauty of this project is we're not envisioning any constitutional amendment that would be needed. We're just talking about returning to what was intended in the Constitution.
That's right. I would just add, as a matter of record, there's nothing proposed under the Article 5 process that can't be done with a stronger Congress that passes laws, executes, and judiciary that adjudicates under the Constitution. Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to turn this over to Jim Capretta, who's going to organize our first panel. Thank you.
Well, good morning. My name is Jim Capretta. I'm a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And I'm very pleased to welcome up to the podium the panel here. We have Representative Barry Loudermilk from Georgia, Representative Dave Bratt from the 7th District of Virginia, Representative Mia Love from the 4th District of Utah, and Representative Gary Palmer from the 6th District of Alabama. I will make a couple of very brief remarks, and then we will turn to each of them as they get settled here to talk about the issue that's been coming up repeatedly as the conversation has proceeded this morning on the power of the purse. It's obvious to me, I've been working in budgeting. Perhaps I need to make a confession here that I did work in the executive branch. And I worked on budgeting in the executive branch at the Office of Management and Budget. And that required me to oversee quite a bit of spending. And I think a lot of the criticisms that have been made about the process are actually very, very accurate. And so this power of the purse that is the subject of this panel is probably the number one issue that needs to be addressed. There's so much decision making that is now reduced to just a few people at the end of the year in closed rooms with little accountability and no process for the public to see it through their representatives' eyes. And so much of it feels like it's broken, and many ideas are starting to bubble up to try to begin to address it. And so let's get started on that by turning first to Representative Mia Love. We'll have her go first and describe some of her thinking around this subject, and we will then proceed to the other panelists in turn.
Thank you.
Powerful presentation.
Wow. It's still very loud.
Microphone.
You're
off.
There you go. Okay. There we go.
There you go.
Okay, so thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'm really excited about this project and certainly excited about the prospect of restoring Article 1 of the Constitution back to the United States government. One of the things that Senator Mike Lee talked about was excluding the American people from the process. One of the issues that I believe that has made it very difficult and has excluded the American people are these large must-pass bills at the 11th hour, some of them actually on autopilot. And one of the frustrations that I have is all of the other pieces of legislation that's tacked on to the must-pass bills. Pieces of legislation that Congress can't read, let alone the American people, so that they can actually let their representatives know exactly what is going on. It's really interesting with just kind of my thinking is getting back to the process. What I've realized is every vote that we take really doesn't matter unless we restore the Constitution back into our government. I dropped a bill that I actually thought would go nowhere. It's one subject at a time bill, just to kind of see if we can clear the air a little bit and allow the American people to be part of the process again. Allow for us to talk about bills, to vote down bills without holding hostage our military, without holding hostage the things that we actually should be legislating on, which is our military and some of the few powers that are, I should say, issues that Washington should be taking care of. Very limited pieces of legislation. Really interesting is that I dropped this bill and I started messaging out to Utah, and I found that it's actually spread like wildfire. Not just conservatives that are really attaching themselves to this bill, but liberals on the other end that are tired of their representatives voting for legislation that they don't want them to vote. Talk about getting back accountability again. There's no reason why we should vote for a highway bill attached to XM. There's no reason why we should have these large must-pass bills where you have a Speaker of the House that says we should pass it before we understand what's in it. That is not how government was meant. That's not how our government was set up. So I have to go to those markups, by the way. My chairman left those markups, but I believe that there's good news here. So I believe that this bill is actually getting some legs, not by Congress, but the American people, which will force Congress to hopefully get this bill to the floor, but it'll start to clear the way. And restoring the Constitution, I want to warn everyone that restoring the Constitution, especially Article 1 of the Constitution, doesn't mean that we will not make mistakes. That's not what that means. It's far from it. As a matter of fact, our country has made many mistakes, but it allows us that when we do make the mistakes and when government starts to reign over the American people, under the large umbrella of the Constitution, we have the ability, the people have the ability to restore that, to fix that problem. And so I want you to know I'm excited. I've got a lot of hope for this country because the people that are sitting next to me and the people that are working in Congress, I have to let you know that there are some great people there, and I'm honored to be part of this process. It's our responsibility to make sure that we preserve this great country for all of our children, especially my 3 that are at home that are expecting me to do something about it. So I want to thank you. Thank my Senator, Mike Lee, for involving me in this project. He's a great partner, and I'm excited about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll turn now to Congressman Loudermilk, who has been very, very active on these questions, has a few ideas around. He's got a lot of ideas, as a matter of fact, in this area. And so why don't I just turn it over to you, Congressman, to talk for a few minutes, and we'll go down to the panel after that.
Well, thank you. Let me first thank Senator Mike Lee for including me in this. In fact, I showed him after the State of the Union. I happen to have a copy of his book regarding balanced budget with me on the floor. I found that is more interesting reading than what I was hearing coming from the rostrum. So, and purposely sat where I wouldn't be on the camera. So, as others, I've been sitting out here looking at this painting, and what intrigues me about this painting is that you see these founders, these framers in action. They're not sitting at a table. They're not just sitting there with one person in debate, but they're caucusing, they're discussing, they're working. I think it sort of reflects what you see, but in a more chaotic way, what happens every day on the floor of the House of Representatives. Because there's work being done. The other thing that struck me was something that gave me an answer this morning as I was sitting out there. One of the criticisms that I have heard from members of Congress and also members of the press and others, if you look at the makeup of this Article 1 project, the majority of the members are freshman members of Congress. The majority of the panels, we do have the experience and leadership of some that have been here for a while in both houses, but the majority makeup is freshmen. And the criticism is, how are you guys going to be able to fix this problem? Well, as I was sitting out there and looking at this painting, it dawned on me. Only 5 people up there in that painting were there when they signed the Declaration of Independence. This wasn't the Continental Congress. They were meeting elsewhere. These were representatives from the states that brought in the ideas and the concerns that the states and the people of the states and the state legislatures would have about building a government that could grow into a very powerful government. And that was their greatest fear. One thing these founders understood, they understood human nature. They also understood the potential of the growth of government if it was not constrained. And so while they may have envisioned that we wouldn't be in the position we are today as a culture, as a society, they did understand that if we didn't constrain the government would be in a position that it was today and of executive overreach, because if you go back and you look at the Declaration of Independence, in the Declaration of Independence there's 27 grievances, and all the grievances are grievances against executive overreach. Ironically, when you read it, the first 7, there are many more, but the first 7 actually address overreach of legislative powers. It shows how important this was to our founders. Not only did our Constitution set a framework that constrained the power of a federal government, it also put into place the ability for the most accountable and directly responsible to the people branch of this government to hold the other branches accountable. And the way they framed that is through the power of the purse. One of the problems we're facing today is there isn't a single purse. Their idea was that Congress would control the power of a purse. When you look at what's happening in many of the departments, many of the agencies, some of them are becoming closer and closer to being self-funded through fees and penalties and fines that they claim are outside the reach of the appropriations process of Congress. That's one of the areas that we have to address. The other thing that the founders envisioned is that this Congress, or any Congress or the legislative branch, would also know where the money is being spent. Knowledge is power, but ignorance is weakness. I think Congress has become very ignorant of exactly where the money is being spent once it is appropriated to various agencies. Many years ago, there was something that we are wanting to look at as part of this Article 1 project. There was something that was known as the Byrd Commission. It preceded, the Byrd Commission was given the responsibility as a committee with the subpoena power to be able to go in and look deep, do deep diving into every appropriations to find out where there's duplication, where there's fraud, where there's waste, and where we're spending money on projects that we no longer need to spend money. These are the types of things that we need to be doing in Congress today, is doing some deep diving, going into the details, looking for areas of fraud, waste, abuse, but also duplication of services. These are the things that many of our state legislatures are doing. They have a single purse. In fact, when I served in the state of Georgia, one of the issues that often faced those who just wanted to raise taxes that were specifically for some type of project were always frustrated because the Constitution of the state of Georgia specified that all revenues went into the Treasury to be appropriated by the legislature. All revenues, regardless of how those revenues were received, if they were by a fine or they were by a penalty or they were for a fee. All revenues went into the legislature. Of course, the special interest had major issues with that because they wanted their fee for tire disposal to go to environmental issues. And they did not want that left just to the whims of the legislative body, but the whims of the legislative body are to be reflective of the culture and the will of the people. These are just some of the areas that I think that it is important to us address early. We have several other ideas, but I don't want to dominate the time here because this is something that is very important. I have a 1.5-year-old granddaughter, and every time I hold her and I play with her, I think she deserves better than what we're passing along to our next generation. She deserves much better. These guys intended that each generation would be better off than the previous generation. Right now, Americans don't feel that that's the case. But we have the opportunity, as they did, to make a change, to effect change, to actually bring some common sense restoration of our constitutional powers to this body, and to make the American people feel that they have some power as their representative bodies, as they will be able to hold us accountable. With an $18 trillion debt and growing, We have to change the way we do business. And again, I thank Senator Mike Lee for the vision to do this.
Next, we'll turn to Congressman Brad. Please proceed.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for the comments. I didn't know what I was going to say until Barry teed me up, so now I've got some comments.
You're welcome.
So it's good. Thank you very much to Hillsdale and Senator Mike Lee for putting this together. Couldn't have a more important topic right now in terms of getting things straight. The one thing we haven't weighed into at all is politics yet. And I don't think we're going to get any changes until the politics turns, right? You're going to have a wave election, and the people are going to have to put pressure on their representatives. So all last year, you can just look at the budget process, and I'll get into that in a minute, but just look at what we're voting for as a conservative conference. And the budget number, I think the whole process last time, even by the speaker, was called the crap sandwich. Everybody eating breakfast already, so I'm not upsetting anyone, right? And cleaning the barn. And now this year, we're going to vote on that new high number again. And the Senate is hinting that they've already adopted that number, and then that's going to put reverse pressure back on the House, that we're going to have to live up to that high number. And everybody knows that the whole debate, right, you got 70% of Republicans voting for outsider candidates right now for a reason. They're very upset. And why is that? Because they know the American people aren't getting represented at all. So I even asked Bernie Sanders the other day at the White House Christmas party. I went up to him, I said, hey, I'm not putting you on the spot. And, I'm just going to ask you a question. I said, up here, I said, everybody in the press and everybody wants this horse race story. What do you think of Paul Ryan, this kind of thing? And it's about conservatives versus liberals. I said, my experience up here in 1 year, it's not about that at all. I said, it's about the middle that has conspired to increase budgets to $3.5 trillion a year. And that pressure of all the special interests comes down on Paul Ryan's head. And no single person is strong enough to withstand that pressure, right? Especially when you have the whole conference making deals and special interest projects, and everybody's representing their people and needs something special in their state or wherever. It's tremendous pressure. And so that's the politics in a rough way. I don't have any stats on this painting behind me other than to say they're all Virginians, right? So I'm from Virginia, sorry.
Not all of them.
I just want to get my Alabama colleagues riled up. Anyway, I gave my announcement speech back when I ran a couple years ago at St. John's Church, Patrick Henry. James Madison wrote the Constitution, is from my district. I went to Princeton Seminary. He went to roughly Princeton Seminary. When he graduated from the College of Jersey, he took Hebrew just for kicks, right, for a year. So when you talk about the worldview that informed the Constitution, it's a particular worldview, and it's a particular worldview that may not be informing the American people right now, right? The Judeo-Christian tradition and the inherent conservatism built into that worldview, that human nature is not utopian, it's fallen. And if you don't start off with that framework in your head, you're going to end up with the wrong logic and the wrong kind of document, the wrong kind of process. And so thank God Barry brought that up, because that helped me put that together. But we need to change that, right? And that has to do with K-12 education, educating the kids on what liberty is really about. Liberty, you only get liberty if you have the law. So liberals tend to forget that part, right? You get liberty because we tell the government what they cannot do. And so let's just get to the budget to show you how serious this is. So we've heard all the numbers. The debt is now up to $19 trillion. The deficit this year is going up to about $530 billion. Under Republican leadership of the House and the Senate, we're increasing the deficit this year by $100 billion. We're increasing the deficit by $100 billion this year. So if any of you want to help get that out to the people, that might inform their view of how we're doing up here, right? So the deficit's $500 billion. By 2022, it'll be $1 trillion a year. The deficit, the amount we're adding to the debt going forward, so it'll get to $30 trillion within no time, right? So that's when China's having a hiccup right now because they're at 2 times debt to GDP, right? 2 or 3 times. We're 1 time, right? We're 19 trillion. It's about the same size as the economy. So they're having a hiccup, major hiccup. They may not come out of it, and Greece is way past that, and that's where we are in terms of debt load. More serious than that, the unfunded liabilities are $100 trillion, right? That's the amount we've promised to pay in law, in the mandatory spending stuff that we have given up our power to control, oversight, everything. 2/3 of the budget is that right now. In 11 years, all federal revenues will go to unfunded liabilities, mandatory programs, and interest on the debt. In 11 years, there won't be $1 left for national defense, education, transportation, or running government. In 11 years. So anyone that doesn't think this is timely, you're not paying attention to the numbers. In 11 years, it's all over. And I don't know if we can turn it around, right? You're going to have the will of the people somehow grasp that, vote against their own self-interest, rediscover a thing called discipline, and we're going to ask voters to vote for that. Right here, take some bad-tasting medicine. It's for your own good. That's what we're facing, right? We have to convince a majority of the people to take bad-tasting medicine, and there's no way around that. Votes in the concrete. There's tremendous pressure on us in the conference to vote for everything that sounds good. Last year, we had a thing called the Cures Act to help kids with cancer. I voted against it. You're not laughing. You can laugh. That was a joke, right? My brother does neural path down at Emory. His inbox was flooded. What the hell is your brother doing up there? Right? I voted against it because we created a new mandatory program. We're already 100 trillion light, and the Republicans created a new mandatory program to fund the Cures Act. So I said, fine, I'm nuking it, put in the Bratt amendment. My brother's last name is Bratt, so it wasn't a pleasant day for him, right? And that's that. So, but it all sounds good. Are we going to vote yes? Take the easy way out in conference? Yep. If you vote yep, you get the problems I just said. Tremendous pressure on all of us. So we need pressure coming back from you to solve the problem. Paul Ryan, to his credit, we're doing regular order. The House Freedom Caucus and Senator Lee and a bunch of other support have come in on that project. That's the biggest progress we've made. Right, that commitment to regular order in the appropriations process, but keep your eye on that ball. I'm not optimistic as to the outcome of the approps process this year already, from what I'm hearing, right? So keep your eye on us, hold us accountable, and I'll just end it right there. I probably went on too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. That's very good. Last but surely not least, Congressman Gary Palmer from Alabama's 6th District.
Dave gets on me all the time about not smiling much. After hearing that, do you know why? Okay, I'm going to be brief. Some of you know I ran a think tank for 25 years. I've worked with Matt for years. Because of a lot of what I've read that Matt's written, I have a very clear understanding of how our system's supposed to operate. And Barry touched on something about the unappropriated funds. So I'm just going to get to some ideas. Is this off the record, or is it going to be on Fox News tonight? Crap. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to fix my own crap sandwich. I'm introducing a bill that will prohibit any funds, unappropriated funds, from going to any federal agency. All of the funds will go into the General Treasury. This is something I've been working on since I've gotten here. But they will be identified with the agency where they originated. And one of my biggest issues is with the Consumer Financial Protection Board that gets its funding, all of its funding, from the Fed. Congress loses all oversight. We completely lose the power of the purse when we allow agencies to collect unappropriated funds. So these funds in this bill will go to the General Treasury, identified with the agency, and then it'll be up to the appropriating subcommittee's jurisdiction to appropriate that money back to them if they deem it's worth it. We've also got to change, in my opinion, how we appropriate, and I'm working on other legislation, that right now, if this cup were an agency budget, it's like a silo. Come October 1st, we fill it up. They spend it through September 30th, and October 1st, we fill that thing up again. Well, we lose all ability to have any oversight control over the appropriation once it goes into the silo. When we try to walk it back, what do they say? You're shutting down the government. So what I'm recommending is that we change our appropriation process. We will appropriate an amount that will fill the silo, but we will give Treasury directions to only release a quarter of it at a time with instructions from Congress. And here's why. When the executive branch doesn't carry out the mandates of Congress, doesn't implement the laws that we pass, which, by the way, Matt, I think is part of the oath, isn't it, that he will faithfully execute the laws of Congress? if they don't do that, if an agency's not doing what they're supposed to do, we can, the next quarter, direct the Treasury to withhold, say, $50 million. That is not even a rounding error in the budget. It doesn't shut down the government, but it holds that agency accountable. If the next quarter they still haven't done what they're supposed to do, we can withhold 75 or 100 million. We can make it painful. They'd start laying off people. And frankly, I think we'd only have to do that 4 or 5 times before everybody would get the message, and it would restore congressional oversight over federal agencies. That's how you regain the power of the purse. The other issue that we don't talk about a lot is regulatory reform, and it is the secret path to appropriations. Federal agencies are making rules; they're implementing them to the tune of $2 trillion. Now, that's what regulations cost our economy last year, was $2 trillion. That's $15,000 per household. We need to break down the regulatory reform process into component parts, if it's regulations related to community banks, we need to have a working group that's just focused on community banks with community bankers actually in the process, regulators under the oversight of Congress. Get rid of the obsolete, get rid of the duplications, get the regulations that we're going to keep, and simplify them so that the regulators actually understand what the regulations say themselves, because frankly, a lot of them don't. And it's killing business in the U.S., and it's a hidden cost. It's not a hidden tax. The tax actually goes to support some government program at some level. This doesn't support anything. And the impact that it's having on the economy is enormous. In 2008, there were 100,000 more businesses started up than closed. In 2013, there were 70,000 more businesses closed than started up. In terms of entrepreneurism, we rank 12th in the world now. We're behind Hungary. So we got to take that on, and that's part of Congress restoring its oversight authority. I think we've got to define agency jurisdictions better. I've got a bill stopping EPA overreach that declares that the EPA does not have the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. Okay, most people are going to think this is a battle over climate change, okay, or over the Clean Power Plan. Maybe so, but what it's really about is reasserting congressional authority to make law. And I've urged my colleagues on other committees of jurisdiction to look at the agencies under their committees for examples of overstepping their authority and introduce a 2 or 3 page bill that simply says Congress never gave you that authority. So we've got to take back our lawmaking authority. We've also got to take responsibility for what we allow the agencies to do, and I think the REINS Act is a key part of that. And I think most of you are familiar with it, but if you're not, it simply says that if any new rule from an agency that has an economic impact of plus or minus $100 million has to go to both houses of Congress and be passed and signed by the President. Those are just some ideas that I've thrown out there that I think make sense. I think we also ought to have, I'm working on legislation right now that on some tax issues and on how we do some budgeting. But I don't get some, I understand the philosophical basis for what we ought to be doing, but I think that we can talk to that till we're blue in the face and makes us look real smart and intelligent and all that crap. What we need to do is get out there with real solutions, and I think time is short. We got 10 years maybe to get this straightened out, or we're going to be right where my colleague Dave Brett says we're heading. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're out of time at this point, so I will ask my colleague Yuval Levin to come up and introduce the next panel on regulatory accountability.
Morning, everybody. The last panel not only ended on a very cheerful note, but it also ended on more or less the subject we're going to take up now, which is the question of the regulatory state. So I want to first call up the panel. 3 great members of the House, Representative Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming, Mark Walker of North Carolina, John Ratcliffe of Texas. Why don't you come up and I'll say a few words while you get yourself settled. I want to first of all thank everybody that's involved in making this happen. Senator Lee and the his colleagues in the Senate, all the members of the House who are doing this. It's just enormously important that this conversation happen, quite apart from what immediately comes of it on the floor, where individual ideas go, and I do think some of these will go far. Having this conversation, raising these questions is enormously important, and I'm very grateful also to be part of starting this conversation with you today and to be invited to be part of this launch. In a sense, our conversation this morning is about a question that everybody takes up, and you could imagine if you just watch Washington from a distance, that everybody kind of agrees about, which is that Congress is dysfunctional, right? Almost no one would say, no, Congress is in great, great shape. But what does it mean to say Congress is dysfunctional? What is the function that it is failing to perform? I think too often when people say Congress is dysfunctional, what they really just mean is it's not passing the laws that I would like. And a lot of these debates are not about institutional change, but are about policy preferences. But there is one function of the Congress that ought to stand above partisan politics and that ought to stand above policy debates, and that is the fundamental function of the Congress in our constitutional system. The role of the Congress in keeping that system balanced and in using its powers, in using its authority to keep that system in check. And in that respect, there is just no question that Congress is dysfunctional. It is not performing its most basic function in the constitutional system. It's not using the legislative authority that it's granted. And the subject of this second panel gets right to the heart of that question. It is really about how Congress can wrestle back some of the power that the executive has taken, or that, as several members have said this morning, in many cases, the Congress has given over to the other branches of government. And so we're especially concerned here with regulatory power, with reining in the regulatory state. The Article 1 project proposes a number of different kinds of steps to start taking some of that power back. A regulatory budget, changes in the Administrative Procedure Act, the REINS Act, civil service reforms. We're going to discuss all of those, and we'll talk about a little bit the general vision of the role of the Congress in what has become an out-of-control administrative state. So why don't we start, as the last panel did, with some remarks from the members. If we have time after that, we'll also get to some questions and hear about what concerns you all. And we'll begin with Representative Lumbus.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Senator Lee, for putting this project together and including so many of us to participate. I'm going to talk specifically about regulatory overreach and mission creep by the executive branch in the area of public lands. I'm currently the chairman of the House Western Caucus, where we're very concerned about the administration's overreach in regulatory issues affecting those lands. Now, recall, the federal government is the largest landowner in the United States. It controls a third of the land in the United States, 6 times the size of the state of California. Over 90% of those lands are in the West. Now, most of them were set aside under a law called FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act in 1976, for multiple uses, meaning they could be used for recreation, for conservation, for sensible natural resource development, whether it was mining, oil and gas, grazing, and logging. But between this executive overreach and this barrage of regulations, for example, the EPA's new Waters of the U.S. rule, they are usurping what was never meant to be an issue of federal control. The waters in the United States, particularly in the West, have always been the province of the states, pursuant to the 10th Amendment, and the Constitution makes clear that states have that right. However, under the Waters of the U.S. rule, they have usurped control down to the puddle in states. In my own state of Wyoming, there is a couple, husband and wife, who got a permit from the state of Wyoming to legally build a pond on their property, and the EPA came in and is fining them thousands, tens of thousands of dollars under this new rule. It is absolutely beyond belief, even in this age of regulatory overreach, that this kind of thing could happen. Of course, states have sued. The courts are holding this regulation at bay until it is determined whether it was properly implemented and whether it is regulatory overreach. But it shouldn't have to go that far. Let me tell you about another law where overreach is just run amok, and that is the Antiquities Act of 1906. Does anybody in this room know what that is? Okay, one hand. The Antiquities Act gives the president the right to proclaim monuments on federal land that contain, and this is the statutory language, historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest. So the law was originally designed to protect quickly federal lands where archaeological sites were being affected by theft and looting. Of course, Theodore Roosevelt was among the first to use this act effectively. Now, here's further statutory language. By law, designations of monuments shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with proper care and management of the objects to be protected. Once again, smallest area compatible with proper care and management of the objects to be protected. Now, some monuments are less than an acre, being consistent with the statutory objective. But several presidents over the years in this creeping mission have established massive monuments, including Escalante Staircase, which is over 1 million acres, Glacier Bay, over 1 million acres. President Obama recently declared the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks region in New Mexico a national monument. And it was originally proposed with the assent of the local legislator, Steve Pierce of New Mexico, to be 55,000 acres. The president chose to designate almost 500,000 acres, not contiguous. The largest monument on land is St. Elias, covering 11 million acres. And what's happening now is presidents are using the Antiquities Act to create multi-million acre marine monuments. President Obama added 261 million acres to the Pacific Remote Islands Monument using the Antiquities Act. Now let's go back to the language of the law. By designation, a president can use the Antiquities Act to protect the smallest area compatible with proper care and management of the objects to be protected. Now, in your mind, is that what 261 million acres is? This is where the executive branch overreach, either through regulation or by mission creep, is expanding its role. And, of course, then the federal government, you, the taxpayers, have to pay to manage those lands in a way that is extremely costly and never contemplated by the budgeters and the appropriators and the taxpayers. This is the kind of egregious assault on the law and the regulations and the Constitution that I believe Senator Lee wishes to address. And I once again want to thank him for his extraordinary vision in taking this project on at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Congressman Ratcliffe?
Well, this morning,
Before you speak, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to slip out. I'm speaking at a keynote address in about 15, 20 minutes over at Heritage.
Would you like to go first, or do you
I didn't
need
want to.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Well, just maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Sorry for the inconvenience, John. Thank you.
no.
We've talked a lot about today about the nuts and bolts of what the problems are. But this, we're preaching to the choir today. As we transition, and one of the things that I respect about this, it's not only designed to talk about the what, but the how. How do we effectively communicate the change that is necessary? And that is where the people come in. You know, I think of this in a couple approaches. There's a vertical approach of where we're being intentional and holding Washington accountable, political organizations, those who want to strip us of our liberties that we continue to see eroding. And it's important. We've heard much about anger lately. Have you heard about, can you be angry? Can you not? Listen, Patrick Henry, you remember give me liberty or give me death. Martin Luther said, you know what, when I'm angry, I preach better, I serve better. Keith Miller, great author of the 20th century, said this. He said, nothing in a social change in America's history has ever been accomplished unless the people were angry. It's okay to be angry when we're holding people accountable. When we should be compassionate. But there's also that horizontal approach where we have to be able to communicate what's important constitutionally to the people that we live with, to our coworkers, to our friends, our family, and our neighbors. Recently, I won't name a name, but there's a presidential candidate, and I'll put it this way. As a former minister, in fact, I officiated a wedding just last Saturday evening, and there's a passage there from 1 Corinthians, not 2 Corinthians, that only been around since King James, a few hundred years, but it talks about having compassion, but it talks about all these accomplishments, but it profits nothing. It uses the reference, a clanging cymbal. Now, I've directed choirs and orchestra as part of our ministry background. Clanging cymbal is pretty much worthless, but it's the loudest instrument. So I thought about this. You know, if you don't know the difference between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, do you know the difference between Article 1 and Article 2? It's okay to be a loud voice as long as you're doing more than just making noise. And that's why I have thoroughly enjoyed partnering with Senator Mike Lee. See, there's a difference between just being conservative, but being an effective conservative. And that's where all of our roles come together. To be an effective conservative, we have to communicate. These topics aren't making the front page of the Wall Street Journal or Time Magazine or anything else. It is our responsibility to talk about the importance of why we hold the Constitution and why it's important when it comes to the governance of our body. Wish I had more time to share, but I think I'm on stage in just a few minutes. I want to thank again Senator Mike Lee. Certainly I want to thank the wonderful people here at Hillsdale for the great privilege to partner with you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Congressman Ratcliffe, we'll try again.
You know, this morning, you've heard from some of the leading voices of conservatism that have spoken eloquently about our founders and their vision and our need to reclaim that vision. I wish I could be that guy, but that's not really who I am. The perspective that I can give you is one as a new member of Congress and someone who now representing 750,000 Americans, in my case 750,000 people in East Texas, hears frequently from my constituents, when are you guys going to stand up to the president? When is Congress going to do that? When is Congress going to stand up to federal agencies? When is Congress going to do something? That's really the issue that we're all hearing in our districts. And, you know, you can give a real sort of nuanced answer that part of it relates to 60-vote, cloture rule in the Senate or other types of excuses. But the real answer is the one that Senator Lee talked about at the outset of this, is that Congress needs to reclaim its power. When the senator asked me to get involved in this project, he said something that struck me. He said, we need to reconstitutionalize Washington. And that's really what this is about. Congress getting back to its role, and it's not just the power of the purse. As you've heard from Cynthia's remarks and others here, Congress under our Constitution, as we all know, is to be the sole lawmaker in our federal government, and the bottom line is today most laws are not being passed by Congress. Most laws today are really being imposed by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats in different federal agencies. Cynthia, you talked about the waters of the U.S. That's a perfect example. Of an agency just suddenly changing an interpretation of what main waterways of the U.S. The definition of that is to include adjacent bodies, which can mean the streams and ditches in our own backyards, and that really wasn't the congressional intent behind that. And the problem that we've had is, as the son of two school teachers, is we all learned that we have three separate but equal branches of government, and maybe that's how it was intended to be, and maybe that's how it generally has operated. But things have occurred along the way, as everyone here has highlighted, where we've gotten away from that. And so, what this project gives us an opportunity to do is to focus on those things. So, for instance, one of the impacts to that respect is a Supreme Court case in 1984, the Chevron case. And essentially, those of you that are familiar with it, essentially says that if there's a congressional statute that has any ambiguity in it, agencies are allowed to apply any reasonable interpretation to that. And so long as it's reasonable, they're able to do that. And the end result is, for every law that Congress creates, those agencies go out and create regulations which really have the effect of law. And so, one of the things that I'd like to focus on here is the initiative there is how can we reform the Chevron deference, as it's called, or the Chevron two-step, because that's one of the things that's contributed to this, disparity in power between Article 1 and Article 2 as it's currently operating in our federal government. So there's so many exciting initiatives that we can approach together. I'm, again, grateful to be here this morning and to be part of the project, and appreciate Senator Lee allowing me to be part of his vision.
Well, great. Thank you very much. Thank you both very much. We have a few minutes for questions. If anybody's got a burning question,
please wait for the mic.
Yeah, please wait for the mic.
Thank you. A couple of comments and a question. We have a number of presidential candidates, certainly on both sides, and we're hearing what they are going to do, and we're not getting any inclination on the part of those candidates to include the Congress in their activities. And one of the things I think we need to be careful about, even in prayerful anticipation that we have a Republican in the office, is to hold that person accountable and not let them run away with the store. And Senator Lee probably, this applies to all of the panels, I think. And what are we prepared to do when our president seems to be willing to run away with the store?
Yeah, this brings up a very important question. It's easy for us as conservatives now to see the dangers of executive power because we don't like what this particular executive wants to do. Would we be in the same place with a Republican president? And isn't that really part of why this project has to start now? Either of you wants to.
Well, going back to the subject that I chose to focus on, even President George W. Bush designated an 89 million acre national monument in the Marines, in the ocean. So it is not just Democrats that are exercising this extraordinary expansion of federal overreach. And Congress should have reined him in. and prevented that kinds of overreach. When we allow those things to occur without reining in and exercising our Article I powers, we're giving tacit approval to the ever-creeping mission of a bloated and irresponsible bureaucracy. So we have abrogated over the years as a Congress our mission. I had endorsed for president Senator Rand Paul, in part because he had expressed an interest in serving as a president who would cede power back to Congress. He wanted to use what has become presidential and executive overreach to restore Article I powers to Congress. And he unfortunately may not have the opportunity to do that given the current state of play in the presidential elections. But I would hope that some of his fellow candidates for president would choose to exercise that part of his agenda and help restore to the people of this country the opportunity to set their own destiny through their elected officials.
I would certainly echo the comments from Cynthia, but and primarily to the point that the Article I project isn't about partisanship; it's about constitutionalism. And so, to give you an example of the reforms that we need to do, applying regardless of a Republican or a Democrat administration, is statistically there's an aberration that occurs at the end of every administration, Republican and Democrat. A mad rush of what are called midnight regulations from the time that a new president is elected till the time that the outgoing president leaves. That period of time, there's a surge of regulations where folks are concerned about legacy issues, and that happens at the end of every administration, Republican and Democrat. And that's now, it just so happens that later this year we're going to see that, and it happens to relate to the Obama administration. But historically, it's happened, again, regardless of party. That's one of the issues that we're focusing on because it's a problem that has been a historical problem, and so the one that we're trying to fix. And so I think that really speaks to the fact that what we're all here to do is to get back to constitutionalism, regardless of the label that's applied to it or the party that's affected by it.
Let's take one final question over here.
Thank you. Steve Klein, formerly of Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Homesick. This is at least part of this project broadly. Do you see any room for litigation in this? I work mostly in campaign finance law, and the Federal Election Commission has been defined by litigation from Congress, whether it was James Buckley in the 70s, Senator McConnell in the early 2000s, and even today. They were working to limit the agency's power, and today we have representatives suing for them to expand their power. Congressman Van Hollen is in litigation right now. Particularly with the EPA, there have been great successes in the last few years. They haven't certainly been cure-alls, but even 9-0 opinions from the Supreme Court, at least bringing some limitations on the powers of the EPA and certain other agencies as regards to land rights. So certainly it's something, it might speak against constitutionalism for Article I to go ask Article III for permission to reinforce its power, but is there perhaps room for future litigation of that type against these agencies for their arbitrary interpretations of the law?
My perspective on that is, that we certainly want to focus on legislative solutions here with respect to the Article I project, but essentially we need to deploy whatever tools we can to restore a system of checks and balances that is in place. And so, recently the House gained standing with respect to litigation against the executive branch. I think that's part of the one of the tools in the toolkit that we can use to restore that sort of balance. But I think, within this project itself, the focus is going to be more on legislative solutions.
I think two things about this. One is I would like to see the area of regulatory takings law be more fleshed out so the president is more clear about what constitutes a regulatory takings. And I also want to point out how important this election is to the composition of the Supreme Court going forward. Obviously, the next president is going to be in a position to shape the court. They can shape it in a way that allows this continued opportunity for the executive branch to reasonably or unreasonably interpret legislation, or can hold agencies to a stricter standard by virtue of their Supreme Court decisions. So an often overlooked consequence of who we elect as president this year will be their effect on the court. And I would encourage everyone here to point that out to your fellow voters.
Thank you very much. Let's thank our panel. Appreciate it. We'll close with just a few more words from our host, Matt Spaulding.
Thank you. Just very brief comments, since references have made to this painting several times. I'd point out this is a particular moment at the Constitutional Convention, the morning of September 17th. The document is done. The windows have been opened. Madison is handing Washington the pen to sign the document. In the middle, Benjamin Franklin is gesturing to Washington's chair, his famous quotation. Is that painted on the back of Washington's chair a setting sun or a rising sun? And he now knows at this very moment that it is indeed a rising sun. That's still true today, not because we hew to an old 18th century document, but because this document creates the most dynamic and greatest framework of a self-governing society man has ever invented. And we want to recover that dynamism for our own good and the good of self-government. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and have a good day. Thank you.